So, ihr Lieben.
So, everybody, we've got one more presentation, and I've again invited myself some support here, and I'd like to hand over the mic right away.
Hallo, ich heiße Joshua Wolf.
Hello, I'm Joshua Wolf. I'm 24 years old. I live near Cologne. And the next presentation is Julie's, and her topic is building a solid educational program.
Thank you,
Dankeschön, Joscha. Okay, so I'm very happy. I'll wait till you get your headsets on, because this will be in English. Guten Morgen. I'm very happy to be back here. I was in Oberwesel for the conference in 2016. It's so nice to see some faces and families that I remember from then, but there's so many new families, so it's been really wonderful the last couple days meeting you and seeing your children, and I hope what I say today will be helpful. I talked with Claudia about different topics that I could present about, and we thought it would be nice to try to think if there's a way to link some of the things you've been hearing about observation and assessment from David and the person-centered planning from Nancy, and then what Gail just shared, and think about how you could use those things you learned to work with your school teams to help you develop learning goals and a solid program for your children. But I want to start out with saying I am from America. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and so what I'm speaking of is what my knowledge is of how the American educational system works. So I really understand that it's different here, and I also understand that some things I may share today, you might think, well, that's really needs to be the teachers or the psychologists or someone else professional's role. But what I think you can do with what I share today is perhaps use it when your school teams are developing a plan for your child. And you can think about, are they doing these things that I heard people at the CHARGE-Syndrom conference say would be important to think about for a program. So that's my hope. And here we go. And here's my plan for today is, so we'll talk about thinking about assessment, and then you have to do something with that, and you always have to start with assessment. So how do we link assessment to how we then develop a good program? And I am going to, my background is working with children who have multiple disabilities. That was I worked for 10 years as a intervener and a teacher, and now I work with I'm like a deafblind specialist, similar to what Gail is in England, for a state project in California. So we now are the professionals that come in and help school teams or families that are new to deafblindness and don't understand it well. And a lot of the children that we get referrals for, I would say, in fact, I told David this the other day, I would say half of our referrals are children with CHARGE syndrome. And my approach has always been very similar to David's. I worked alongside him for a while at the project, and but it's very much related to thinking about the child first and very authentic and positive assessment. So we'll think about assessment, how you connect that to the goals, and then what would be particular considerations that you may have for developing a program for a child with CHARGE. And maybe we'll have time for questions, but maybe not. And I also appreciate that you're all here for the very final session on Sunday. Good for you. Last night I went for a walk late, and I walked down the road to the end of the street, and I have to say it sounded like you all were having a very fun time around 9:30 down here. So I think that's great. Oh, the other thing I want to say that I'm very happy about, and Yosha, it was going to be my remark if Yosha said my last name, but it's very nice to be presenting somewhere where people pronounce my last name correctly, Maier, because in America, whenever I'm introduced, they say Julie Maier, but here they say Maier, so that's right, yeah. My father's grandfather came from Munich area. Okay, so I thought I'd start with some photos, and this is Timothy, and I'll talk more about him later, but this is a big milestone event for him that happened earlier this month. His mom just sent me these pictures, but he just graduated high school, so our secondary school, and he has CHARGE syndrome. We have been working with him and his family since he was very young. David Brown was the first early interventionist that went out to meet them, and so there he is, very proud and happy, and he's now moving on to a transition program. So he will be in that from 18 to 22, and he'll be working on a lot of the things that you just heard Adam talking about, getting ready and prepared for his adult life, so vocation and independence. And but what I want to tell you about this is it wasn't easy to get here. So I'm showing you this now thinking that maybe some of the things I say today can help you picture what this could be like for your children, but also knowing it took a lot of hard work, especially, so that's his parents up in the top right, especially his mother, absolutely tireless advocate. Right away, just like many of you, when her child was very young, she was at the CHARGE conferences and going to every session and writing down what every medical professional was saying, every educational specialist. She connected with the Deafblind Project right away. She now serves on our advisory board, but she had to continually advocate. And that kind of just became her role within the family, is just looking out for his needs. She has 2 other sons that are a little older than Timothy. He also went through a lot of different programs. So it changed over the years. He started out in a completely deaf program. He's profoundly deaf and uses sign language to communicate. But as he moved up through elementary school, it became harder for him to access the curriculum and learn the lessons only in a deaf classroom because of his additional needs and disabilities. So then he went to more of a resource-supported program. But by doing that, he was giving up some of the community of being around sign language users besides his intervener. So it was hard to just get it right. Then when he moved into middle school and high school, he went into a class that even had higher levels of supports and a more modified curriculum. So he's still learning academics, but he wasn't able to keep up at the same level of his peers. And now he's moving into a program, so many of his peers are moving on to community college or college. He's moving into a program that's very focused on vocational skills and adult life living. So that's one thing, too, that things have shifted over the years, and it's all been based on continually doing assessments and seeing what his needs are. And then finally, down on the bottom, this is the thing, and I said this to a few people yesterday that came in for consultations. So his mom was an advocate. His mom's his champion, and his dad and his brothers. But it's so important sometimes to have someone on the school team who also serves as a champion for the child or who gets it. It doesn't have to be the whole team, but if there's one person that is going to be there and say, like, you know what, I think the parents are right. We should do more assessment, or we should develop these goals, or we should make this change to the program. So here you see 2 people at the bottom. The person on the right in the white shirt is his teacher of the visually impaired. She sees so much potential in him. She's going to be continuing to support him as he moves on to his transition program. She's helped get him summer internship work jobs. She's just been amazing. She's seen so much capacity, but she was trained in vision, but she learned sign language. She did all these things to help support him, and she's really been very vocal at his IEP meetings that they get this right. The other person is on the left is his teacher of the deaf, who also, and she's deaf herself, but she's then gone and learned all these specific things related to CHARGE, related to his vision, to make sure that the services she's providing. So to have that again, in some ways you end up lucky if you get those people, at least where I come from, but it's always good to try to identify who that can be. And then finally, down here on the right is the person that's sitting in the black robe next to him is his intervener, who happens to be the brother of a deaf individual. So he grew up signing in his own life. So, and this is, again, very rare, but he has been his intervener since kindergarten. So he's taking him all the way through. And he's told the parents, I'm going to see him till the end, and then I'm going to retire. But he's going to get him 3 more years till the end of his program. So it really does take that kind of team. So I thought that would be a good example that I just received the other day in the mail. So I'll move on now. I think we have to think really, when we think about assessment, realize that some educators are going to be thinking about assessment in a typical way that they do it for most kids, and it's really hard to do that right for children with CHARGE syndrome. It's very complex. And part of the reason it's complex to get it right is because people are still learning a lot about CHARGE. I mean, you're here learning about it at the conference, and many times when it's not right after a lockdown and COVID, there would be an education day, and educators would be getting this information. But people just don't have enough knowledge yet, so sometimes you're going to have to be the person that has the information about CHARGE syndrome to tell them that they can't forget to think about both the vision and the hearing and all the other sensory issues that David has been sharing and talking to you about. You all know better than I that you have to also think about the medical issues. So you can't just think about school and not think about their health and not think about medical. So that's another reason that it makes it difficult. And then because of especially a lot of the early health issues or hospitalizations and things like that, there are going to be some delays in their progression and their skill development, and that should be expected because they haven't had the same opportunities yet, or they've been dealing with medical issues. So, but that doesn't mean that they won't come. And you've heard throughout the weekend all these examples of kids that then do achieve these skills. They are able to do these things. They just aren't doing it at the same time as their peers when they're young. And then really thinking about that multisensory impairment and how it all connects together. Brings it down to the final point that it has to be multifaceted. The team has to be collaborating. So that would be another thing that I hope that you'll find with the school teams that you're working with, that the different professionals are communicating well and that they're able to step out of their different roles and learn from each other and really look at the whole picture of the child. Those are all things that are just so, so important. Next slide is I'm going to share Jan van Dijk from the Netherlands, and many of you have probably heard his name if you're we talk about him a lot with deafblind education and a lot around CHARGE syndrome, but this is one of my favorite quotes, and it certainly applies to children with CHARGE syndrome. He wrote in 2001, and he was thinking back on his career as a deafblind educator, and he really was someone who informed all of us in the field. I mean, every person who's a deafblind consultant from the 80s until now has been influenced by him. The multisensory impaired person is a unique human being with a unique line of development who's more dependent on the professional's willingness to accept this. Okay, they have to accept this and act accordingly. That's the other piece. Than any other group of disabled persons. So that's his personal opinion, him thinking back on what he's learned through his career, but I absolutely agree with it 100%. It talks so much about the responsibility that professionals hold to understand that we can't just fit them into this program. We can't say, okay, he's deaf, he goes here. The child has a vision impairment, he goes here. That we think the child has an intellectual disability, we'll put them in the special needs program. They have to really act accordingly and accept the fact that they've never met anybody like this child. And each of you, they've never met anyone like each of your children with CHARGE. Just because they've met Yosha doesn't mean that they've met Henry or Anna, or every one of them are completely different, okay? So that is really, really important. And so what I thought I would try to do is think about the order that I believe building a good program should occur. And it always needs to start with the assessment first, okay? So you start with the assessment, and again, I mentioned earlier, I think it needs to be a very child-centered, authentic assessment. And Claudia, I just noticed that the article about capacity building versus deficit framing is in the Trommel Verba. So there's a whole article that I wrote on it 6 years ago if you want to go deeper, but I'm not going to do that today because we could spend the whole hour. But so that's the first piece. We'll talk about that more. Then from there, then you look at what you learned from the assessment. That's how you identify what the goals should be. So we don't just say every child that's in this kindergarten program that has a vision impairment has these same goals. We're going to have very unique goals. And then we think about the program and supports and services that you develop, how you design the program, should just tie to what the goals are. So you can't just, it goes back to what David said yesterday, that there's no program that's been created yet for your child with CHARGE syndrome. It doesn't exist. We can't just fit these kids in a box. I know they try. I know that's what they do. That's what they do in the United States. I'm sure that's what they do in England, Gail. I heard yesterday from a lot of you that that's what they do here. So I'm sorry for that, because it's not right. And there are ways to change that by you being the person that's always getting right there in the front and saying, yes, but you need to do this, or yes, I heard this, or read this article, okay? So, because it's going to have to be very, very unique. Okay. So, and then this is one of my very simple quote from David Brown from one of his articles. And again, I think this is in one of your Charge magazines over there about what does follow the child mean. But David simply says, we assess because there's things we don't know, but we want to find out. Okay, so there should be this curiosity. People shouldn't just be doing the assessment because they have to tick off this box, or because they have to do the assessment before the kid can get the service. I know that's why they do it, and that's how you qualify for services, but there should be a bigger reason, a more important reason that they're wanting to do the assessment. So it's very simple, and it really is the essence of what child-guided assessment is. All right. So a capacity building perspective. I also think what happens a lot, I know it happens a lot, is for all kids with disabilities, in probably every country, is it's very easy to recognize the deficits. And it's very easy for someone to look at a child or read something about a child or hear about a child and think that all we have to do is find out the things that the child can't do, the things that are missing, and then fix those things. But I take a very, very different approach. And I think if you take an approach that's more based on capacity, on who the child is and what they can do, and you learned about that yesterday with David's questions, what they're interested in, what we hear a lot about the child refuses to work. So you heard the story that Gail said that the boy didn't want to do the storyboard and tack up the nail. Well, but maybe he would have wanted to engage in the literacy lesson in some other way if it was something that was highly interesting to him. This morning I was watching David moving around the room with Henry, and I'm going to use him a lot this morning, actually, as an example from what. But, you know, clearly Henry likes to walk around the room and push someone, and I learned yesterday that that's called choo-choo for him, so he's pushing you like a train. So maybe that's all he wants to do is push you around the room, but maybe you want him to learn some of his letters or learn vocabulary or learn about characters in a story. So then do a literacy lesson about what? Trains. Don't make him read a story that might not be interesting, but he might come over if you're, and again, I don't know him well enough, but these are the types of things I ask people. I'm like, well, what do they like? What are they interested in? Use that. Because you can't get anyone to engage in learning until they want to be there. And motivators are really, really a strong way to do that, especially with children with CHARGE syndrome. And then the other thing with capacity perspectives is you really have to think about all that different sensory function and what things may be compromised, but how are they using them in some other way? And we've certainly seen this a lot this weekend, is lots of creative ways that children are figuring out things that they need so that they can either be using their hearing better, using their vision better, feel more regulated in terms of their senses and things like that. You'll look at how the child communicates, not that the child can't communicate because they can't do it the way that their other peers are, but what are they doing to communicate to you the things that they like, that they want, that they don't like. We'll look at behaviors, and we'll specifically look at the purpose of behaviors. And then I think it's really important when you're doing a capacity, using the capacity building perspective, to think about the supports and accommodations, and rather than saying like, oh, we've already enlarged the work for him, or we've given him extra time and he still won't engage in the work, he still won't do it, he still refuses. We talked about this yesterday with a family. Okay, so that doesn't mean he can't do things or that he won't do things. That means that you haven't figured out the right support or the right accommodation yet. So we have to continually keep trying new things when things don't work out. And that goes back to that willingness to accept how different their development is and then meeting them there and acting accordingly. And I know that that can be exhausting. It can be exhausting for families, all of you, and it can be exhausting for educators, but it's something that we simply have to do if we're going to get this right. Okay. So key points of assessment. The first is it's the starting point. So I already mentioned that earlier. And then next thing is that your involvement is very important. So again, in good programs, professionals will invite you to participate in the assessment. They'll do that by interviewing you or asking you for former reports or getting your ideas about what you think would be most relevant goals for your child. If they don't do that, look for ways that you can share that information. We talked to some people yesterday about developing a journal or an All About Me book, things like that where you can share information about your child. But you should be involved in what's occurring with the assessment process. It's essential. And then professionals need to be gathering information from the people that know the child well, starting with a blank slate and not simply going and asking people that already know the child. So if you think back to Timothy, talking to his family, but also talking to the other service professionals that worked with him, talking to his intervener. Sometimes as kids get older, continuing to talk to their classmates, to their siblings. They know lots of information. So who knows the child well and can get that information for you. And then a really key thing is that specialists need to step out of their expertise and their role and really look at the whole child. And that sometimes is another thing that I think happens that makes it difficult with assessment is the speech and language person only thinks about how the child communicates or things that are related to their oral motor, but doesn't think about their vision and their hearing or their vestibular or proprioceptive sense. Same thing with the hearing specialist. So I showed you that example earlier of those two professionals that learned things about other people's roles because they knew that was important to understand Timothy as a whole person and all the different parts, and not just think, I'm the vision teacher, so I come in and see him once a week and I just do things related to that. You really have to, they have to see the whole child. That's not always easy, but hopefully if you can have one person on the team that sees things that way, they can help model that for other people. Or they can help ask those questions or give that guidance so that occurs. And then for children with CHARGE syndrome, well, I think with all children really, but because I'm not a big fan of standardized assessments, especially for kids with multiple disabilities and for children with CHARGE. But we really have to go beyond the use of just a typical assessment. So the ones that they might use for all the kids that might have specialized learning needs in a program, and they've got, 4 different assessments that they always use for those children. Because children with CHARGE will not do well on those assessments. They won't pass those assessments, and they will be underestimated their abilities. So I recognize that those assessments are sometimes necessary for people to get services, at least in our country. So lots of times, so here too, yeah. So you have to do that assessment so you can say the child needs these services, these supports. But if that's the only thing that they do, that assessment, and they don't do anything else, that's where the problem will occur. Because, and I see some nodding in the room, but it's because then they've done this assessment, your child has not done well. So now they have this expectation for what your child's going to do. And we talked yesterday with a family whose child is, she's in the class and she's well behaved. So she doesn't get a lot of attention. And she doesn't have an intervener yet. So she's not getting a lot of attention because she's not causing a problem. Lots of times the kids that, act out or have a tantrum or do things, they get a lot of attention, they get a one-on-one. But for a child who's well behaved, but she's not learning, she didn't have access to information, so she's there. But because I believe that they've probably got a very low expectations for her if they've only done these standardized assessments. So it really has to be well beyond that. And David and I in 2016 did a whole presentation on that, so that's not for today, and that's in some of those articles, but that's something to really think about. So this next slide talks about this approach of child-guided assessment. And the key thing that I want to point out in it is just this middle bit, which I'm not sure I'm getting it right because I'm looking at it in, my German's not that good, but right in here, that we look at, so right here, how does the child learn things, not what the child knows. I mean, it's nice to figure those things out, but not what they know based on the assessment, but how do they learn things? What's the process that they use? And again, David showed you and talked about lots and lots of examples of how we figure that out when we think about his 4 questions. But the child-guided assessment approach, which was developed by Van Dyke, really thinks about, look at the child in their natural routines and environments, and how are they using their vision? How are they showing you that they want to learn more? How are they demonstrating that they recognize something new? So today, if you think about the child-guided assessment, I'm going to use Henry again, but it was really interesting to watch how he let David know, he was leading David around in the room doing the choo-choo bit, which was nice to see because David is, you know, last time you saw him was 4 years ago. So it's a long time. And David wanted to do something else. He was trying to just take a nice photograph with him, because again, that's what would be really nice for his family, if he would just sit down and take a picture with David Brown, and then they'll have a picture of Henry with David, the great David Brown. But Henry's like, no, I'm not going to sit down for a picture. And so he just started pushing David around. And it was just really interesting to see how he was playing this game, and David tried to change it. David's like, oh, let me hold your hands, and we're going to do this. And then Henry's like, no, I don't want your hands. I'm putting my head right here, and I'm keeping my hands here. And then David tried to stop, and then you just stay. What's going to happen? And then he pushed. So there was so much to learn from what was happening. And then at a point, he wanted to stop, and he laid down on the ground. And that was at the point, and David didn't go over and then like, no, let's play our game. Let's keep going. Come on up. He said, no. David recognized, okay, you're taking a break. And you're laying down, and now you're rocking your legs back and forth. You're thinking. So, you know, really using those observational skills. And again, you can't, I heard David say something yesterday. I came in for a minute, and he said, you can't get this done in an hour. And that's the problem that happens sometimes with assessments, is these things, someone's going to do an assessment, they have to get it done before the meeting, so they come in 1 hour. And then you go to the meeting, and they start to tell you these things about your child, that your child can do, or can't do, or doesn't know, after spending 1 hour with your child, and is an unfamiliar activity that they might have introduced you to. So not a natural thing, not using the things the child knows. And I know that, and I've been at these meetings, okay? I'm not a parent of a child with disabilities, but I've been there as an advocate, and I've been at these meetings and watched people's faces as they sit there and tell you these things about your child. And I know that you're just nodding and being polite, and all the things that they miss, and all the things that they got wrong. So, and I'm sorry that is a reality. And that's why it's important that families should be part of the assessment process. But using this child-guided assessment really is going to be way more helpful in developing a program, because it's going to show you what the child needs, what kinds of breaks they need, how they do communicate. So I'll just say that, and there's a reference there of where you can find this article. And then you've, of course, got David's 4 magic questions. So he spent a lot of time yesterday, so I'm not going to go through that. And you've got the article in the magazine. But if teachers don't know about these 4 questions, show them the article. David's also done webcasts on them. And then I think are you recording these sessions? Yeah, so have them watch David's recording, okay, if they don't know those 4 questions. Now, what I want to also tell you about very briefly, because I know there's a lot more that we have to cover, is so Kim Blake, if you came to her session yesterday, Dr. Kim Blake, and she talked about the medical checklist, and you got that handout in nice colors and things like that. So that's been super helpful and very useful, and Kim's trying to get that in everyone's hands. But one of Tim Hartshorn's students developed a similar educational checklist, which is not yet in German, but I know all of you, and I know it will be sometime. But Lily Slavin, who was at the 2018 conference, I think, developed this educational checklist of needs for children with CHARGE syndrome, and it's very, very good. And it can be super helpful to teams. I share it with teams all the time in California. And what it talks about is that we have to, again, think of all these component parts of a child with CHARGE. So we can't, this child's in your classroom, but you can't not think about the medical issues of this child. So whether it's their swallowing and eating, or if it's fatigue and heart or breathing or medication. There's all these medical issues that have to be thought about, and teachers are going to have to learn some things about and know who the specialists are that can support them. Same thing with sensory. You need to think of all the senses. And then oftentimes communication, development, or academics and things like that, and behavior are thought about in schools, but they've got to think about the medical and the sensory. And then I think it's really important that we can't forget about social relationships and the development of social relationships and social skills. And I think that really fits into thinking about communication and development and behavior at those points, okay? So the next slide is just going to show you how they've set it up. So it's not an assessment. It's a tool that teachers can use to better understand a particular charge characteristic and how it would be related to an educational need that people are going to have to address. So a lot of the medical and sensory ones have to do with different types of equipment, different types of maybe health or medical breaks that a child needs, or sensory breaks, things like that. But it links it, so you think about the educational need, then you think about who would be the team member that I'm going to consult with that. So is it going to be the nurse? Is it going to be a vision specialist, hearing specialist, occupational therapist, intervener, special ed teacher? They've provided lots of examples of strategies and accommodations. That's the bit that I think is most useful for teachers, because if a teacher can't come up with an idea that would be maybe helpful for a child with charge, there it is. So that's something they could try. And then finally, consulting professionals. So that's where someone like a deafblind specialist might be brought in, or a different medical doctor, or maybe sometimes mental health therapists or behaviorists, things like that. So again, Lily does whole webinars on this. There are some that have been recorded in English, and if people are interested, I put my first slide, and I'll tell you again at the end, you can just email me. And I'd be happy to share it if you want the English version of one of her recordings, and she explains the whole checklist. Okay, one other thing really quick that I think happens with assessment is I think people go off on these detours. And I think, that, again, the most likely reason they go off on these detours sometimes is because they don't know CHARGE syndrome. So lots of people recognize and have heard of autism, or heard of attention deficit, or heard of adjustment disorders, things like that. So we're very quick, I think, sometimes to put that kind of label on children. So we go on these different detours, or we think a child has a developmental disability or an intellectual disability, but we do that with kids that are not yet communicating, whether they're using spoken language or sign language or some other form of communication. And if they can't communicate and let us know what they know, we should not make the assumption that they just don't know anything. But those are kind of these detours that go off on. So again, I think as parents, what you can do is really watch out that these detours aren't that they aren't putting these additional labels, or they aren't forgetting that your child has both a combined vision and hearing loss. David talked about that yesterday. If you think about that pyramid, remember, and he talked about how most of the learning that occurs incidentally, effortlessly. We do not think about so many things that we learn in the world because we are just watching and listening from the time we're born. So a child who has limitations in vision and hearing misses so much. So we shouldn't expect that they're going to understand a lot of these concepts or have learned things. But so we have to go back and think, do they not know the chocolate idea? Do they not know about white chocolate because they've never experienced that? So if we don't think about their vision and hearing and the other multisensory things, we just neglect to think about that, I think that the assessment's missing a really, really big piece, and you've gone off on this detour. And I won't go into whether or not children with CHARGE can have an additional disability, because that's, again, a whole nother session. But I think it's important to think about, is another label useful or helpful? If it helps you get services, more services, then it could be useful. But lots of times, adding an additional label to a kid just puts them in a whole nother box for people. And again, they're just not seeing the whole child and the uniqueness of your child. Okay. When we think about developing the learning goals, and the program for children, we're going to base it on what we've learned from the assessment. And this slide just has a list of the multiple areas that have to be thought about. So that's a lot. But if a school team is saying to you, like, well, we did the assessment, you might want to, like, show them just this slide and say, really, did you complete the whole assessment? Did you look at every one of these areas? Because I think for children with CHARGE syndrome, every one of these areas needs to be addressed. And a lot of it has to do with, again, that lack of incidental learning or that delay that they may have in it. Because until we get things right with, in terms of figuring out the right, if they're going to have some kind of aided hearing system, or we're going to make accommodations for their vision, or until they've gotten good orientation and mobility services and have learned how to use some of those different devices, okay? All right, so who's involved in the assessment? Well, I've already told you, obviously you, and so just, I don't know, just make sure you're just not too quiet and polite. Just get right in there and just keep saying, but I have things that I want to share. You can go, at least in America, I don't know if it's true here, you can show up at the meeting with your own written letter or list of things that you want to share about your child, or make an all about me book, but have a way that you're getting that information to them. But it helps to, a lot of this also is dependent on developing those relationships with people and with teachers. So again, think about who are the people on the team that you can develop that relationship with, so that maybe you can get that information into their reports too. So families involved, familiar, trusted people, and support staff that know the child well. If you're assessing in particular areas, those specialists, and ideally someone that knows CHARGE syndrome. So that's the other thing to think about is, and I know that there are teachers that are trained in this country, specifically in CHARGE syndrome. I know they might not be in all of your regions, and that's true in America too. But think about, or even someone that knows something about deaf blindness, a combination of vision and hearing loss. And then you also might need to be consulting from medical professionals. And then real simply, I use this slide a lot just to tell people when you're thinking about assessment, you've always got to have that first step of where you stop and just plan, how am I going to do this assessment? And what I think you need to do before it even begins is just think about, well, what do you want or need to know? So that goes back to that statement by David. That's why we do it, because there's something we want to know. But you don't always have to start over at the beginning. Think about what information do you already have? Okay, so you might already have a lot of information about the child's communication or their vision and hearing, or different things related to their motor needs, and thinking about the vestibular and proprioceptive sense. So if you have that information, who has it? And again, lots of times, you know who has it? All of you have it. So hopefully professionals are thinking of asking about that, but they also might think about, okay, well, let me talk to their former orientation and mobility specialist, or their former physical therapist, or the former speech therapist, okay? So who could have that information that you need? And then it really is important to get background information from the family and current teachers, both on their academic and their medical. And then we've been stressing this a lot throughout the conference, a lot of the presenters, and I'm going to do it once again because it's so important, that a good assessment really has to think about all the senses. And so again, there's some good resources out there specifically about the vestibular and proprioceptive sense, which are the ones that people don't know about. They're the forgotten senses, as David would say. They're the ones that we use the most. We're reliant on these. We can't use any of the other senses without a really effective working vestibular and proprioceptive sense, and none of us know about it. I was teaching for years before I heard about it, so they're not the ones that we teach about, but a good assessment is going to think about that. They're going to think about smell and taste, and we know with children with CHARGE, lots of times that's very compromised, but they need to think about that and know about those things. And then what they should pay attention to is, with the senses, how are they working well together, and how might they interfere with each other? How are they compensating? So that's really, really essential. And then this next slide, I talked about this last year. I did a session at the virtual conference around communication and how we can enrich the environment to support communication. And so this is just a reminder that, and I said this a lot in consultations yesterday, I think a lot of times behaviors that we see with kids, especially things that are unexpected or maybe undesired behaviors that we see in children and youth, we label it as attention seeking. So that's good if we've identified, if that's correct, and we know that they're trying to get that attention and they're not doing it for another reason. But I think we have to think about if children are continually doing things to get our attention, are they maybe saying, I want to connect with you and I want to have some interaction? And so can we think about other ways that a child can get that attention from you without like maybe tossing a glass of water off the table or having a tantrum? Maybe if we just are remembering to like engage with them a lot more, or finding out what their interests are, or deciding that I am going to be like, Henry's dad and play choo-choo all weekend around the conference. You've put on a lot of miles at this conference. So think about, but when we think about that though, too, is I think we have to think about who they're trying to connect with. And are they trying to connect with other people? So that's an external communication attempt. They're trying to get you to pay attention to them and they want to respond to you. Or are they trying to connect with their own body? And then so that goes back to the vestibular and the proprioceptive. So you see a photo here of, it looks like a pile of blankets, but there's actually a young child with CHARGE underneath there. And she's on a beanbag chair. So she's squished into a beanbag chair and she has a couple of heavy blankets on top of her. And she's in preschool, because she's just done a lot of work for about 30 minutes. And she needs to go lay down right now, and she's going to fall asleep. She's 4 years old. It's really, really hard. And she's going to wake back up in 20 minutes, and she's going to be able to go on with the rest of her day. Or not the rest of her day, the next activity, because then she's going to take another break. But if you don't know this child well, you could think that like, oh, she's trying to, I know another child who loves to climb under blankets, and you're going to hear about her in a second too, but she never is just going to go to sleep. She's doing it because she wants to play hide and seek. So she's doing it because she wants to connect with other people and play, because she's always moving. So that's important to get that bit right. Let's see, I've got to look at my English papers. And then the next slide, the next two slides I'm going to kind of zip right through because you heard many of these things from David. But these are the types of things to look for in those results. What's happening with the senses, what's motivating the child, and what do you see in terms of what skills are emerging in all those different areas. And when we think about supports, I think the important thing to think about is, okay, what supports or accommodations are being used, and what works, what's not working, and what seems to be missing. And then finally, when we go back to behaviors, because we can't forget behaviors, is you have to get that right. Why are they doing? What's the function of that behavior? Are they asking for your attention, or do they want to connect? Are they trying to get access to something, like they're trying to tell you they want to have an item? Or are they trying to get out of this situation? They're like, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be with you. I want to go somewhere else, and that would be access to something else. Or is it just sensory seeking? And then a complete child-guided and centered assessment will really identify at the end, you'll know who this child is because you'll know what they're really good at. You'll know what their strengths are. It'll look positive. You'll know what interests them. You'll see what skills they could possibly learn next, which is going to help you develop those goals. You'll know what supports and services are helpful and accommodations, and then you can start to think about what those goals would be. So now what I want to do is show you 3 examples of 3 kids that I've been working with in California. So we'll first start with Jessie. This is that girl that was underneath the blankets, and she's now in a deaf program. She's going into 3rd grade, but this was years ago at preschool. And so let me tell you what if using a child-guided capacity building assessment shows you about her. So she loves music, she loves to dance, she loves taking photos with an iPad. So right away you could start to use those things to engage her in learning. You have to use a total communication approach. That was a big problem at the school. They were seeing all these tantrums and behaviors, and it was because they were forcing her to communicate in one particular way, and she was trying to communicate in another, and they were not. She was using all these modified signs that she was using at home, and they would not accept them because they wanted her to use a picture exchange program. a picture symbol. And so she was signing, and they were telling her, no, tell me what, yeah, I know. I see your face. I know. It was really hard. I witnessed the whole thing. Yeah, she kept signing. They said, what do you want? They wanted her to say open with her card to open a door, and she was signing open. She was signing open. She was signing, and they just kept saying, no, no, no. And I finally said, she's telling you open. They said, she has to show me the card. And I said, so that was changed after the meeting. But anyways, she needs, if she has supported seating, she can be very, very focused. But if she doesn't, then for obvious reasons. And she needed those breaks to lie down and rest, so they allowed that to happen. And then transition items really helped her. So if she was going to go change her diaper, you gave her the diaper. If she was going out to the recess yard or going to walk, you gave her cane. Those things helped her get ready. And she hated to make mistakes. She had huge tantrums if she made one small mistake on a little, in preschool, you're like just, painting and gluing. But so it helped her a lot to know what was expected. And then she needed intervener support for health reasons and communication. Then we have Madeline, who's a first grader, and still one of the most fascinating kids I know. And she's super imaginative. I think she's going to be an engineer someday. She's so amazing with blocks and Legos and things like that. She's the biggest roughhouser. She just wrestles with kids all the time. And she needs frequent breaks too, but she needs movement breaks. You're not going to get her to lay down. She needs to just keep moving. She also uses an iPad, but she uses a camera to enlarge visuals. So that's been really cool to see, that they've figured out a way that she can actually, and she's doing this at 6 years old. She's learning how to sit, and she's in a general class, sit at the front row and get close enough to the teacher when she's reading a story and make the camera big enough so that she can see it. So that was great to see that kind of assistive technology used. But she needs a lot more time to complete assignments. She gets very upset. You can't tell her the next activity is happening if she hasn't finished. So what we did is decrease the amount of work she did or gave her extra time. You can't, and you probably know other people like this, you can't just have a sudden change happen. You have to let her know ahead of time. And then she mimics people. She's a really, really, really good mimic. And so I suggested, well, let's use that to help connect her with peers. Because it wasn't easy for peers. She's in a typical class, but she uses sign language, a little bit, she has a cochlear, a little bit of spoken language. So it was hard for peers to connect with her, but thinking about the ways that she would mimic them and could learn things from them, that was a good way to connect them. And so she used an intervener for a lot of different reasons, beyond just language, but managing behaviors and also explaining and modifying work. And then you already met Timothy. There he is going to prom, getting ready for prom this year. So that was very, very exciting. He was so proud of himself. Yeah. But you can see, just looking at that, like you can see, look at the fists he's holding his hands in, like that's probably helping him very much stand there and stay regulated and stiff for this photograph. And yeah, I'm just, and so for him, he is super curious about people and an environment. Every environment he goes into. So he would be the person that would come into this room, and he'd be right away coming around, checking out the room, seeing what's here. He'd be going up and checking out your name tag. Who are you? Where are you from? So those are, and so instead of that being a problem, let's look at that and like, that's who he is, right? So fit that into the situations. He needs a modified curriculum now, so they've changed things with that, but he does love to learn. He likes routines to be, and he likes to know what's happening next. So he is continually asking his intervener or his parents or his brother, what's going to happen next? And then, and then, and then. So you have to kind of know about those things. And again, not see it as a problem. Like, oh my gosh, he won't ever stop asking about that. He's not focused on what we're doing. It's like, no, tell him what's happening next. And then he'll focus on what you're doing. But he's too anxious about what's going to happen next. And then you have to identify certain times for him to talk about particular topics, because he has certain topics he likes to talk about a lot and over and over and over. So instead of having him do that all the time, they've identified times where he gets to talk about those things. So you don't tell him he can't talk about it, but yeah. And then the family now really wants to expand his social circle and also his independence. So that vision teacher that I showed you at the beginning, she now comes to his house 2 mornings a week. And this, I've never heard of this happening in the United States. She comes to his house 2 mornings a week in the morning to help him do his whole morning routine, like make his own breakfast and kind of get ready to go to school, because it wasn't working with the family. Because they'd already had this routine of mom and dad kind of do those things for him. If he doesn't get out of bed, mom and dad go in again and wake him up, you know. Mom and dad made his breakfast. And it was too hard to switch that routine with them being the people doing it. So now his vision teacher is coming in and is like, guess what? You have to do these things. You're 18. Like you're never, and he wants to live on his own too. He's another one that wants to live in his own place or maybe with a roommate, but he wants to move out of the house. So she's like, you're going to have to do these things. So that's pretty good. And then he's also very creative about different postures. And so instead of that being a problem that he has to lie down or that he's going to do these different things, let him do it. I'll show you an example in a second. And then his intervener is actually a nurse. And I told you, no sign language from using it with his own family member. And so and that's very uncommon too, is that you'd have a nurse that also can act as an intervener, but this man became trained to do that. And oh, it sounds like Jonas has that too, that's good. All right, this is a slide from the beginning, just a reminder that we start with assessment. From assessment, that's where we develop the learning goals, and then from the learning goals, we develop the program. And then for goals, what I would suggest that you think about is what were the needs that came out? So you did the assessment. You don't have to develop goals about things the child can already do, but where are the areas where there's needs? And then the goals, and this is really important with school teams, make sure that the goal is something the child can achieve. How frustrating would it be? I mean, think about it. We set goals for ourselves, whether they're professional goals or personal goals. How frustrating would it be to have a goal that really wasn't achievable? It wasn't appropriate. So make sure it's achievable, that it's reasonable, but that, and also that it can be measured in some way, that someone can demonstrate and say that they know how to do that thing. And then where is it going to be taught? What contexts, what accommodations will we use? What considerations are we thinking about in terms of the child's multisensory needs? And then it should be goals that you think are relevant. And if the child's old enough, so you're thinking about preteens and teenagers, that the youth thinks are important. These are things I want to learn. I think what Gail was talking about with choice making and preferences, that would be a great goal to have in any learning plan. But they should be goals that are very important to you too, not just what professionals say have to be taught. Okay, now I'm to the good bit, and do I have enough time? Oh, I'm almost at 11:30. David said I could go a little longer because he said he didn't have 45 minutes, and plus I don't see him. So I'll just keep going until David walks in. Don't tell him I said that. So when we think about kids with charge, and there's not that many, there's a few more slides. There's 6 areas that I think are important for an element of a strong program. And so this is where I've got something. I've been telling you the whole time that it needs to be very personalized and individualized because every child with charge is unique and different. But this is where I'm going to say, okay, not that this would be the same for all of you, but these are things that would be things I would consider for all children with charge, okay? So this is kind of big, thinking about charge, and then you personalize it, make it individual for your particular child. So always thinking about, is the classroom accessible? And is the school environment accessible? So that means not just accessible in terms of physical access, moving around, but is there language access? So is there a sign language interpreter or an intervener that knows sign if your child uses that? Do they have access to the visual information in the room? Do they kind of, lots of times I go into classrooms and they say, oh no, we have a schedule and the schedule's up on the board, but that's not something that the child would be able to see. So what is, or the child might need a personal schedule that's using objects and things like that. So what's accessible? Language and communication access. Is the curriculum meaningful to the child? Have we thought about their sensory needs? Have we thought about social relationships? I think that's so important for everybody, but I have never met individuals with charge that aren't socially interested, right? And then proper support to do all of those things. And then often what we hear with charge, and what a lot of people came and talked to us about consult with, and certainly I get called in about this too, is it's always behavior. But I think behavior is going to be addressed by really thinking about all of these particular elements. If you think about these, if you have an appropriate program, you will see those behaviors decrease. Those 3 children I showed you, all of them, we were called in because of different types of behaviors, but all of them have a very, very strong program now, and the behavior issues aren't there anymore. Okay, accessible classroom environment, organization, things that are predictable. Wouldn't that be something that you'd be hoping for if you had reduced vision? If you didn't hear everything that was happening in the room, wouldn't it help that things were predictable and consistent? So schedule and calendar systems, that there's a space, that we're making a space for a child to take a break or to have that movement break, that there's maybe wide, clear pathways and visual tactile markers. Here on the bottom right, this is outside of different doorways, and for that girl Madeline, at her school, each doorway has a different tactile marker. It's just in a frame that they got at like a dollar store type of thing, and each texture has a different, each door has a different texture. So you can give her a card in one setting to say we're going to go to room 2 now, and give her this bubble wrap so she knows where she's going. It helps her to predict those things. And assistive technology is available. Next. Oh, the language access. So this is actually, this element's so critical, and it can't be overlooked, and really should, and I just can't emphasize this one enough. But oftentimes, total communication is the best approach. So using multiple modes of communication, spoken language, sign language, visuals, tactiles, things like that. But if the child's using sign language, that needs to be one of the primary languages used in the classroom, even if they're not using it. If they themselves are not expressively using sign language, but they receptively understand, because their hearing loss is so profound, they understand visual language better, they need to be in an environment where other people are doing that. Otherwise, they don't have access to the information. That's how everyone else in the environment is getting that information. And if you put a child like that into a class where no one is signing, except for the one intervener, then they're only getting access with that particular person. They're missing everything else. And we would never say that about any other kid, that you can just miss 90% of the information that's being shared in this environment. So if the child is a sign language user, if that's the way that they gain information, that really should be a program you're thinking about. But I know that can be complicated, because I know lots of times those programs are regional or far from your home, so yeah. But, and it should be the child's preferred communication, that you've identified that, you support that. And then communication, this is the other point that's important about this, it should be practiced all the time. Every activity, every routine, not just at snack time, not just during one transition during the day or a communication period, all the time. And everybody knows how the child communicates. Everybody's very responsive to the child's initiation. Okay, meaningful curriculum. I talked earlier about using the child's interests. That can be lots of ways. If the child isn't engaged, you're not going to get their attention. The way to get their attention is to think about their interests. Oftentimes they need to be modified, and you're going to need to think about not just vision and hearing, but also their motor, their balance issues. And I talked yesterday about this with a family, is there needs to be lots of different ways for a child to demonstrate what they know. So it doesn't only have to be that they can fill out the quiz or they can write the essay. Could they audio record something that they know? Could they do a video about it? Could they make a collage? There's lots of different ways for children, so people have to be more flexible with that. And then the other thing to remember with curriculum for these kids, and this goes back to the lack of incidental learning, is the curriculum has to include learning about routines and learning about other independent living skills. Those are things that other kids are learning because they're just paying attention, they're watching, they're hearing things, they're able to try things out. If it doesn't work, they can try it a different way. But if you're missing that information, then that actually has to be part of the curriculum. And the choice making and problem solving that Gail talked about. And that sensory needs are met. So again, we think about these things, that the child has those breaks. This is something that's just so often overlooked, and then people say there's all these behaviors, but they haven't even thought about that. They haven't thought about the breaks the child might need. They haven't thought that the child's doing, that was Henry thinking. Henry was thinking while he was lying on the ground and rocking his legs back and forth. Not saying that Henry won't get up, Henry won't participate. Let's think about it a different way, that he's thinking. And that oftentimes thinking about activities, like another way to engage kids is what are they seeking out? What What types of sensory inputs do they like? Include those things in the activity of their materials, and also the ones that they don't like, that they avoid, don't include those. And then also be aware that sensory needs can change in different environments. So a child might need one thing in a classroom, but in PE they might need different supports. If they're going outside, they might need different supports because of glare or just the vastness of the environment. And then I'll show you a few examples here. You saw the one already of Jessie. So she needed that type of support. She's getting a lot of rest, but also a lot of proprioceptive input. So she needed that. So they thought about that because they put the type of beanbag they did underneath her and the blankets on top. But next is Madeline, and she was in this chair. This was at the park at a party, and she got in this chair and she stuck her head down really hard in the chair, and she was rocking really forcefully back and forth. And I often use this slide to show that I'm sure, and she had one hand in the little pocket, you know, where the drink goes in. I bet a lot of people that saw her doing that looked at her and thought, oh, look at that girl. I bet she's autistic. I know that's what people thought. But what she did, she went and did this for like 30 minutes. She was rocking really hard, her head's really buried deep, and she had been running around. She had gotten really over-aroused. She was very excited. She was at a birthday party, very, very excited. She did that for like 30 seconds, and then she got up and she walked over to the man at the party that was making the balloon animals. And she was able to go up, put her hand right on his arm, watch him really carefully, and she had this whole engaged interaction with him. And before that, she was like a spinning top going around this park. And she knew to do that herself. So if children need these things, let them go do those things. Don't tell them, like, stop moving, stop rocking. And then finally, this is Timothy, and his mom sent this to us during COVID, the lockdown. But so he's at home. It must have been hot that day because he's going shirtless to school, which he doesn't typically do. But so you can see how close he has to get to his computer, and he's got colored keyboards and things like that. But she said, she sent, and I've changed the photo so you can see what he's doing with his feet, because she sent this to David and our other colleague, Maurice, and I, and said, look at how clever Timothy is. And what he had done is he had taken the vent off the air conditioning below his desk. So he took the vent off and he stuck his feet down in there. So now he's feeling very, very well supported while he's able to, like, do his math work and get really close. And he's independently figured that out. But you know if a kid did that in school. And, you know, we too often kids do these clever things and we're thinking like, oh, no, don't do that. You're breaking it. You can't, your feet can't go into the air conditioning vent. Or maybe he also was doing it because it looks like it was very hot that day too, getting more. But yeah, but I appreciate that his mother saw that as a real sign of his intelligence and his cleverness. And then, well, the last two, you've got them. Do I need to stop, Claudia? I still don't see David, so. Social relationships, I mean, I just believe everybody is seeking connections. It can be harder for people that don't have a formal communication system, but students need to, often will seek connections through different behaviors. So the important thing for adults to understand in those things, so if you're thinking about a good program, the adults in the program are able to help to facilitate that, help other people in the environment know that's what this behavior means, or this is how you can engage in this activity. Look for opportunities for kids to take turns together, share activities. Let peers be the ones providing the modeling and support, so it doesn't only have to be adults, especially as kids get older. Think about it, when we were in middle school and high school, you didn't want adults showing you how to do things. You much rather wanted to see how peers did those things. And then again, thinking back to incidental learning, some of your children may not have learned some of the social skills that other people use. So that might have to be something that, again, is part of the curriculum that people think about. And finally, how you connect kids is thinking about their common interests. So we don't always have to think about the person that we think would be the best friend for that person or best support, but who are kids that are interested in the same thing? They like the same sports team. They like to build Legos together. They enjoy cooking, things like that. And then finally, because David has walked into the room now, so I have to stop. None of those other elements happen without proper support. And I do have to say that was something yesterday that was concerning, is how many people came into consult and talked about that their child just didn't have this one piece, the proper support. So, because you need to have someone that's going to ensure that those other things are happening, someone that's going to be there to help support and expand their communication skills, someone that's going to be helping them maintain that sensory regulation or manage those behaviors. The classroom teacher can't do that, even in a special ed class where maybe they have fewer students. One person can't do that. Then you're going to have the child that's just sitting and waiting. And while they're sitting and waiting, they don't have access to the curriculum. They don't have opportunities to develop those communication skills. They don't have the opportunity to connect with other children. So also that proper support is going to think about those medical and health needs that we talked about with the checklist, and making sure that access is provided within the activities and the materials. And finally, do the things that Gail talked about, promote that independence and that choice-making and self-determination. So it sounds like a lot of you, and this is true in the States, you have to advocate for those things. And I know it's hard. I know it's not something you signed up for, but you do have good models because you've got plenty of people here that have done it. But so anyways, I salute you and wish you the best with that. And then there's references at the end. And if I go back to the very beginning, or no, I guess if it just ends. No, shoot. I'll get back to the beginning this way. And you'll see my contact on the front. And Claudia, do you need to come back up? Thank you. Dankeschön.